The state of the country's finances are in much worse shape than politicians are telling us. That's the conclusion of a new report by the Centre for Independent Studies. Its review of policy announcements and other budget pressures shows that new commitments adopted in the last 3 years could add as much as $28 billion a year to spending by 2020. These new measures are accumulating at an alarming rate, it says, and are being given deferred start dates, which means the full fiscal consequences will only become apparent well into the future. If the trend continues, Australia will face the same problems as Europe, a government sector too big to sustain. It's an argument also being mounted by David Murray, the former head of Australia's sovereign wealth fund, the Future Fund. Government spending now represents 36% of GDP and he says is on an alarming trajectory. David Murray joined me in the studio just a short time ago. David Murray, thanks very much for joining us on Lateline tonight.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to first of all gauge your reaction to the report released today by the Centre for Independent Studies that shows that if Australia doesn't rein in government spending, it faces the same sorts of crises that we're seeing in Europe.
Well, that's the very case that I've been putting recently, and the point I think to remember is that the profile of the Australian economy features a volatile revenue base because we're commodity dependent and we're price takers, but at the same time we have a semi-permanent current account deficit, or almost permanent current account deficit, which has to be funded from offshore.
Which means we buy more from overseas than we sell.
Yes, but for each dollar of current account deficit you've got to borrow a dollar from a foreigner, and whether it's the government or the private sector. And at the same time we have very high net foreign liabilities already. So the combination of those three things, if I was giving you advice as a business, I would say you cannot afford very much debt at all in that circumstance. So to keep providing more government entitlement that is debt funded is not very smart, and it is the track that Europe has been down. The whole point about leadership at government level, business level, family, anywhere, is to get a grasp on reality. That's what Europe's not been doing. And the trend in our public finances for some time has not been very sound. At the same time, there is a culture in Australia of never-ending boom and never-ending high commodity prices. I first predicted some time ago that the iron ore price would peak in 2013-14, and here we are in 2012 and it's already peaked. But when I made those comments, people used to say, well, that's just completely pessimistic. The reason I made them was a reality check. What if the boom doesn't go on? How do our public finances look?
According to the Centre for Independent Studies, they estimate that if current commitments are followed, they will add something like $28 billion a year to government spending from about 2020, within a decade. It goes to the point, though, of what we want to spend our money on, though, doesn't it? I mean, the government has made a pretty firm commitment, for instance, to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Would you say they shouldn't have done that? No,
the point is not what we want to spend our money on, it's what we want to spend somebody else's money on. It's borrowed. And so you can accelerate growth by issuing bonds and creating activity in the economy, and you can decide what that activity should be. But if it doesn't work, you've got to repay that growth. So you cannot do it endlessly, as governments in Europe have done, without subjecting your own people to a future crisis, as we've seen in Europe. So it's reached the point for us with the shape of our economy that, in my view, it's gone too far already.
What's gone too far? The commitments?
The size of the debt, given the structure of our economy, combined with the shape of a lot of the state budgets.
The argument, of course, from Wayne Swan is that we're AAA rated. Our debt is AAA rated by all three global agencies. As a proportion of GDP, our debt is the lowest in the OECD at less than 10% or thereabouts, our net public debt, that is. In respects of the G7, they're sort of 10 times larger than us. So where's the risk?
The risk is about the shape of the Australian economy, not the shape of somebody else's economy. The other risk is that we're talking about a measurement for Australia and comparing it with measurements for other countries that are severely bad. So we're comparing 20 to 30% of GDP in government debt with countries that have got 50 to 100. But 100% is a ridiculous number. It shouldn't even go close to that ever. So we're comparing it with the wrong things. We're not taking account of the peculiar shape of the Australian economy, and we're not combining that number with other things. Net foreign liabilities of 57% of GDP is a very high number, and we've just been through the biggest boom in our history, the biggest mining boom in our history, yet the current account is still in deficit. So one would have thought that if the boom was that good, we would have got to a surplus in the current account, let alone the trade, which is only a very small surplus.
Do you think the government can report a surplus?
My guess, I thought, and I said so at the time, that the budget was pretty rubbery, leading and lagging of revenues and expenses, and that it's now very dependent on mining taxes, and with the iron ore price where it is, and I'm more in the camp that it won't recover back to where people say that there's a hole in the budget, and then also with increasing job losses in the public sector and in the non-mining private sector, that will have a second round effect on the budget, which will make it nearly impossible, in my view, to achieve a budget surplus. But if one's achieved by lagging expenditure, playing games with the numbers, then that makes it increasingly difficult in the subsequent year to manage the economy sensibly at all.
Now, the Commonwealth budget is providing more than $20 billion in equity to the national broadband network. It's all funded by debt. The opposition says it wasn't a necessary or affordable expenditure at this time. Are they right?
Look, my view about that is, in a great country, there is a government, and we're talking all governments of any persuasion, there's a government that wants to be held accountable, and an electorate that wants to hold their government accountable. And 24/7 spin in the media and rubbery budgets and all sorts of pronouncements every day about little things without any comprehension of the larger issue make it very hard for people to hold their government accountable. The issue with the NBN is that there is no system of accountability which demonstrates the effectiveness, the productivity outcome of large public infrastructure investments. No transparency of cost-benefit analysis that precedes a decision. And of course, the issue with the NBN is it's extremely expensive and it's being funded off budget. But it does require the debt. There should be ways of trying to do that less expensively, but the real issue is one of accountability and doing the publicly transparent cost-benefit analysis up front, and that wasn't done.
How much of a constraint to business is the industrial relations framework as it sits now? Because there is a lot of criticism about it from company bosses and directors all over Australia. How big an impediment are the current IR laws?
Well, I think they're substantial, but the issue for Australia is that our cost structure has just got too high, and it's in that regime that has happened, and that will be hard to turn around when the terms of trade continue to come back to a more normal position.
Where people find it difficult to break through on this issue is you have government saying that what business is asking for is lower wages. Is that what business is asking for, the ability to cut the cost of the payroll?
That's rhetoric.
Well, so what is it about industrial relations that is hampering growth in business?
Usually it's flexibility.
What sort of flexibility? Can you give us some detail?
Well, what happens normally with new technology, which is the basis for future prosperity and productivity improvement, there must be a change process to adapt to it. And new technology has the effect of fracturing work. So in a great company, people will be trying to make continuous improvements in their work processes to reflect new methods, new technology and new methods. many of the structures in Australia prevent companies from making those continuous improvements because you've got to change the work requirements of an individual, change their authorities, and often the industrial relations law is so intrusive that you can't do that without a complete renegotiation.
Well, when we talk about what's holding the country back, you've discussed leadership generally and said there's a cultural problem. What do you mean by that?
Well, any organisation or country needs a culture that will naturally drive its productivity and prosperity. Now, that culture is affected by what goes on around people, by mythologies. And if people do not have the freedoms and the mythologies are about the wrong things, for example, one mythology is debt is okay. It's okay to fund entitlements with debt because it's been happening for so long, it must be okay.
But neither side of government says that's okay. In fact, both of them talk about trying to cut the debt.
Yes, but whilst governments have been saying that, they've been doing the opposite. And that's the issue. It's about leader behaviour. And so the system has to work to allow the productivity to come out, and the leader behaviour has to sit behind that to make sure that people understand what is affordable and what's not affordable. And we're not really having that debate. People have been allowed to continue in a belief that this commodity boom would go on a long, long time, and it was never going to go on a very long time. That is a mythology that leaders allow to continue for somehow in their own interest, and it's not a smart thing to do as a leader.
And just finally, you've been a critic of the quality of political debate generally in this country. Is that an inevitability of what was a hung parliament, and can you offer any suggestions that would improve the situation?
Look, a hung parliament is never easy. I wouldn't. I probably couldn't do the job that many try to do faithfully in Canberra today. It's a very difficult structure. But I think, you know, at the same time, perhaps the structure of political parties has matured, and that we've moved on so far. One would have thought that with the reforms that Hawke and Keating undertook, you know, it moved Australia a very long way in a fairly short time. I don't think there's been a lot of reinforcing further structural improvements in the economy since that time. There's been some high-quality financial management since, but neither side of politics, in my view, is putting up some serious structural reforms. And I think that's tiredness of the structure of the parties.
We have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming in this evening.
Thank you.